Welcome again to belatedly to this Centre of Higher Education webinar. Andrew Harvey is our guest. He's based in Griffith and he's going to be speaking about widening participation in Australian higher education, reforming the school to university pipeline. I think no further ado, Anna will talk for about half an hour and we can then give you a chance to ask some questions. So it's all yours.
Thanks, David, and thanks for the opportunity to present, and thanks for coming, for those who are here. I'm going to talk a little bit about Australian higher education today. You never quite know how much to assume in terms of knowledge, but please feel free to put in questions if I'm skipping over things or using acronyms you don't understand or anything. Australian higher education, by way of background, well, first of all, let me start by just acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land on which the research that we undertake happens, which for us is the Yugara people in Queensland. But and I also want to thank Rebecca and Lucy Campion who have helped with some of the streaming work I'm going to talk about later. We do traditionally acknowledge country at the start of Australian presentations, and there's a very strong First Nations theme in the higher education work at the moment. And very important that we recognise that we are on unceded land back in Australia. So we always like to acknowledge where the work took place, even if we're a long way from home, as I am at the moment. But in terms of higher education in Australia, just to start by basically saying 93% of higher education is through universities. And of those universities, almost all of them are public universities. So we do have 2 or 3 private universities, but most of the higher education delivered is public universities delivering higher education. There are exceptions to that. We also have vocational education and training, which is our, I guess, equivalent of further education. So that sector comprises a range of qualifications from Certificate 1, which can be 4 to 6 weeks of training, through to advanced diplomas, which typically articulate into bachelor degrees. So we have a vocational education training system and we have a higher education system. And we're trying to harmonise the two better than we have in the past, but that's remained challenging. The other distinctive area of Australia compared to here is we have a federal system. So the federal government, or the Commonwealth government, Australian government, as they like to be called now, controls higher education largely. So they largely fund higher education, although the institutions themselves are set up under state laws. But over time, most of the responsibility for higher education is transferred to the Commonwealth. So higher education is largely a Commonwealth responsibility in terms of funding. Vocational education and training, by contrast, is largely run by the states, although there is a federal regulator and there's overlap in all of these spaces. And that federalism explains a lot of the challenges and on the other side, some of the innovations, I think, in Australia. I'll just give, by way of background, we just had an election a couple of months ago, and the Labor government's been returned, so we have a progressive government, and they're going to continue their agenda that they began in their first term last time. And that was very much around this Australian Universities Accord, and essentially that was a review of higher education. So the Accord covered a massive amount of ground. There was 47 recommendations in the end. This was the result of a pretty wide consultation with the sector around what we want for Australian higher education going forward. So it's commissioned by the Labor government. The recommendations, about 29 of them have been acted on in some degree so far. The government, I think, was fairly pleased with the result of the Accord, and so it will lead to significant change. Having said that, a lot of the progress of the Accord has been mitigated by changes to international student fees, or not fees, but numbers. Cost of living crisis in Australia, not dissimilar to everywhere else in the world. And a lot of the blame for the cost of living crisis went towards immigration, and within immigration, international students are the easiest group, or one of the easiest groups to limit numbers on. So we have had quite a dramatic scaling back of international student numbers. So we're about 30% decline in applications now, international visa applications this year. So still reasonably high numbers, but definitely lots of changes, much higher fees now. I think we're at $2,000 for an application, and much lower rates of acceptance for particular countries. And so we've had a loss of substantial revenue across the sector, and universities really struggling to meet that demand. And that policy has really impacted the equity and growth agenda across the sector. But I've just listed here some of the specific recommendations, and I'll just speak to them quickly. So it's presented in text heavy probably, but the second recommendation was for 80% of working age Australians to have post-secondary qualifications. By post-secondary, I mean either higher education or VET qualifications by 2050, and that's from the current level of about 60%. And that requires pretty substantial growth. And the Accord was very clear that its mantra is growth through equity, that it sees the growth in higher education in particular coming through underrepresented groups. So the 10th recommendation was a series of targets towards proportional representation for 4 underrepresented groups, particularly those from low socio-economic status background, which I'll call low SES from now on, which is people in the bottom quartile essentially. So similar to your polar quintiles, as I understand it, but people in the lowest economic quartile. Indigenous Australians, and I could talk for many years about terminology here, but we will sometimes refer to First Nations Australians, we'll sometimes refer to Aboriginal and or Torres Strait Islanders, and we'll sometimes refer to Indigenous Australians. They all mean the same thing broadly, but people have different views about their preferred terminology. The one thing I think people agree on is that nobody likes to be referred to by their acronyms, so we certainly don't use acronyms, but I might use some of those terms interchangeably. I'm happy to explain a bit more about them as we go on. And then regional and remote students is another group of high priority for the government, another underrepresented group. Around 28% of Australians are from a regional, rural or remote area. And students with disability, or people with disability, is the other group highlighted in the Accord. There are 2 other equity groups in the student equity framework, women in non-traditional areas and people from non-English-speaking backgrounds, but they have not been identified as high priority groups for the government. Reasons I can explain a little bit later on. But actually, I can't really explain women in non-traditional areas. I mean, women are now 58% of undergraduate students, but still only about 15% of engineering students. And the original target in the 80s was for women to get to 15% of engineering and 40% of physics and things. And they got to 15%, we seem to think that was good enough, so it's a bit strange. But the 4 groups they focus on, as I said, disability, low socioeconomic students, status, rural, regional, remote, and First Nations. There is a separate outreach fund under recommendation 11. We currently have a program called HEP, Higher Education Participation and Partnerships Program. It gives universities funding allocated according to the number of low SES students that they enrol. Well, now it's actually 3 categories, but if you're originally slow SES. And that is the money that we use to fund our outreach into secondary schools, as well as to support underrepresented students once they're at university. The Accord proposes to split that fund into one outreach fund for us to work in schools, and then a needs-based funding amount, which is for current students. We'll talk about it in a minute. This 12th recommendation was to expand enabling programs, what we have called enabling programs. These are tuition-free for students. They're typically for mature age students who are coming back into university having not studied for a long time. And they've been around for quite a while. They're not part of the qualifications framework technically, but they're usually 6 or 12 months of preparatory work. So focus on digital literacy, and we used to be essay writing, we don't see writing set anymore, but critical literacy and thinking, all those kind of things. So they're all wrapped up in the enabling programs. They've been expanded by the government. That's important because while we have income contingent loans, as you do here, it doesn't deter many students. We know that it does deter some students because those enabling programs have much higher rates of enrolments from low socioeconomic and Indigenous students than others, usually at least double the rate. So those enabling programs are a very important pathway for residents at mature age level. Needs-based funding is still to be worked out, but it's essentially going to be a loading again based on the number of students you have from 3 of those groups, so low socio-economic, disability, and First Nations. Still not clear how that's going to play out, how much money that will be, what the ties will be on the funding, but it will be, I think it'll be fairly strictly monitored in terms of how you spend the funding to support students from those backgrounds. 40th recommendations around a practicum payment. This is to support students doing work integrated learning during their course. So a lot of courses require up to 9 weeks or more internships, which have always been unpaid. So the government is now providing some payment for those students in some disciplines. There's been some reform to help. So help with the higher education loans program, also known as HEX, and basically the same as your program, not the same, but the same idea as your program here. And they've changed the thresholds. They've reduced debt by 20% for students who have help debt, but they haven't changed the Job Ready Graduates program, which is a differentiation of fees. So, for instance, if you're studying humanities, you pay $15,000 a year. If you're studying teaching or nursing, you pay about $4,500 a year. So, very big differences by discipline. I can talk more about that if need be, but yeah, it's still problematic in terms of equity. They limited early school offers. That was the 20th recommendation. There was concern that we were awarding university offers to school students too early before they finish their final exams. That's similar conversations here, so that might be of interest. And the 30th recommendation is probably the big one in some ways, which is the creation of the Australian Tertiary Education Commission, or ATEC. And that is an independent commission to be established, or interim commission very soon, and a full commission by the start of next year, which will do a lot of this work around the policy reform agenda, probably a bit similar to META in Wales. And New Zealand has, various countries have tertiary education commissions. We used to have one, and we're bringing one back. 32nd recommendation was to set up a Centre of Excellence in Higher Education and Research. We don't have much policy of higher education, we don't have much of a field, so that was recognised. And then 34 and 35 suggested a First Nations-led review of higher education and increased First Nations governance across universities. It'll be interesting to see how this plays out and was implemented. There was a First Nations-led review of higher education some time ago, about 15 years ago, I'm going to say. And we're still way behind in terms of attainment and access, which I'll cover in a second. So they're the ambitious goals of quite substantial growth through equity. This is a pretty courageous vision for Yes Minister fans. As I said, we've got a 30% decline in international applications. We've had declining domestic enrolments in the last 5 years. We've had a declining share of low SES students, and we've got a decline in school completions. So high school completion rates in public schools in particular have fallen by about 7%. So the very big challenges of trying to expand the sector and improve equity in the context of these issues within secondary schools. Of course, secondary schools are not the whole market for universities, but they tend to be very high market. What we find in Australia is the group of 8 universities, which is similar to the Russell Group of universities here, have typically about 70% school leavers, but the regional universities are only about 30% school leavers. Most of their students mature age, so very big differences in age cohorts depending on the type of university. That's just a bit of a racetrack, sorry, but I can come back to it. Higher education and entertainment share, I'll just bring this up to show you some state differences. The thing to note here is you see Queensland and Western Australia have the lowest higher education attainment, which is the dark blue bar. So 36.5% in Queensland, 37.8% in Western Australia, so quite a lot lower than Victoria and New South Wales. And that is partly because of streaming in the schools, which is one of the things I want to talk about. You can see that just differences across the states generally, and the territories. So NT is the Northern Territory, which is Darwin. Territory is about 30% Indigenous, and ACT is the Australian Capital Territory, which is where Canberra. You can go back to geography of Australia. Sorry if I'm assuming some knowledge around the states and everything. Just to give an overview of admissions into Australian higher education. I mentioned income contingent loans. We've had them since the late 80s. Bruce Chapman devised them. Lots of places have copied them, including the UK. It's a great way of preserving equity by making sure that university is free at the point of entry, but every country's got a different way of how those repayments operate and at what level they start. The Australian tertiary admissions rank, the ATAR, is the bugbear of all Australians. This is the rank that you receive at the end of your final year of schooling, which is year 12 for us. If you so happen to choose an ATAR pathway, and ATAR is essentially a re-ranking of your year 12 marks. So you will do subjects in economics and history and physics, and you will receive a study score for that, a score, and then what ATAR does is re-rank your scores according to how your peers went in similar subjects. So it's designed to level the playing field. It's designed to say if you studied physics, and that turns out to be very hard, then everybody else who did physics, another difficult subject, then you should be rewarded, whereas some subjects are regarded as easier, and so they get scaled down. So this is all around scaling of the ATAR. Very controversial, very opaque. No one can really explain to you how things are scaled and weighted, but they are, and so your ATAR is a different number from your study scores, and the ATAR is what universities use to admit most school leaver students. There is a hierarchy of the curriculum around this as well, so students who do physics, chemistry and maths tend to be more likely to go to university and tend to get high ATARs as well. Tertiary admission centres operate across the state, so when you apply to university in Australia, you apply through a state-based tertiary admission centre typically, or definitely if you're in the schools, and you put in 8 or 12 options. So you might say, my first preference is to do law at University of Melbourne, my second preference is to do law at Monash University, and my third preference is commerce somewhere, and you just go down the list, and the universities will assess that, and wherever your ATAR comes in, that's the option you'll get. And then secondary school certificates as well. I just mentioned this because ATARs that's the rank that universities use, but the states have secondary school certificates when you complete as well. So when you finish year 12, you get one of those certificates. You can get a secondary school certificate without receiving an ATAR. I think in at least one state you can also receive an ATAR without getting a secondary school certificate. So it's very confusing. Now, this is Queensland. And what you can see here is that around about half the students in year 12, so the final year of schooling, are eligible for an ATAR and half are ineligible. What that means is that at year 10, 50% of students have chosen to do a university pathway, essentially. They've chosen to do an ATAR pathway. And that involves subjects that are fairly rigorous and that are accepted by universities as entry-level subjects. And the other half of students have gone on a vocational pathway where they're undertaking more VET in schools and more training in the schools, and they're more likely to do an apprenticeship or transition to vocational education or straight into work. About a 50-50 split. However, and this is all based on survey data, I think it's about 80% of students respond as a reasonably good response rate after students leave school. So from the survey data, what you can see is that 75% of Indigenous respondents in Queensland were in the non-ATAR stream, and 58% in Logan, which is the area I work in, which is a fairly low SES area. And that might be an understatement because of the bias in terms of responding to the survey. So it's probably close to 80% of Indigenous students don't do an ATAR in Queensland. This becomes very significant for higher education. This pattern is similar across other states, but it's probably most pronounced in Queensland, which explains, as I mentioned earlier, the higher education gaps across the states. Now, this chart is very confusing. You don't need to read the whole thing. There's that top row, the bachelor degree, is probably the one to look at. So the students, this is Queensland data again. So the students in an ATAR stream, nearly 65% of those students continued to a bachelor degree. So you're very likely, if you do an ATAR stream in year 11 and 12 in school, to go to university. That's really where we're competing for students rather than universities. When we're in the secondary schools, those are the students in the classroom that we're trying to convince to come to our university and not another one. But if you keep going across, you'll see for non-ATAR students, only 5.7% of those students do a bachelor degree. Again, it's probably lower than that given the survey response rate. So, and if you scroll right down to the last row, which is NILFIT, so that's, I call that NEET, but not in education, employment or training, or not labour force, employment training. You can see 4.7% of non-ATAR students are NEET in the year after they've finished school as well. So you're almost as likely to be NEET as you are to be studying university if you do a non-ATAR pathway. I mean, higher rates obviously for apprenticeships and other things as well, but what's very striking to me here is that we are closing doors. So at the age of 15, perhaps 14, students are making decisions that are fairly lasting. Now, it may be that some of those students, of course, enter higher education later in their lives, but clearly those pathways are leading to very distinctive outcomes. And that helps to explain some of this data. So higher education attainment of Indigenous experience, general population, 30% or so, bachelor degree between 25 and 34, 7.8% for Indigenous Australians. And actually, proportionally, even a bigger gap for postgraduate. At postgraduate level, it's only 1% of Indigenous folks in those ages have a postgraduate degree. So really shocking disparities still, despite decades of efforts. And partly, I would argue, explained by that school streaming, which itself is, of course, explained by other things downstream. But we are really making it hard to attract Indigenous students into higher education when 80% of them are not undertaking an ATAR in Queensland. And this is Māori and Pasifika Australians. I mentioned these are some of the groups that we're working with in Logan. We don't collect data by ethnicity typically in higher education, but we can use the Australian Bureau of Statistics, the ABS, to find some census data. And that enables us to see that the green line, the green bar there is Māori Australians, the yellow line is Pasifika, and the much higher orange line is the general population. And again, you see that while 30% of Australians have a bachelor degree, that's only 10% for Māori Australians. And then there's a few things that explain that, including some immigration visas, but again, quite striking differences between different groups.
Just ask a question. Is that 10% of the Maori population as a...
Yes.
Right, so that's a very small population to start with.
Yes, well, yes. So
number-wise, there's very few people.
So Māori and Pasifika comprise between them around about nearly 500,000 people in Australia. So not a high proportion of the population, but a reasonably sort of significant population. And nearly 20% of Māori live in Australia. So I think it's about 16% officially live in Australia. So it's probably unique globally in terms of an Indigenous population where nearly 20% of them live in a different country. And one of our challenges is understanding how that plays out. So how does the Indigenous migration play? Or what's the positionality of Indigenous migrants? So one of the critiques of this space has been that when Indigenous people migrate, they lose their indigeneity and they just become migrants. But those consequences from New Zealand, for instance, in this case, continue. So the dispossession and the other effects of colonisation in New Zealand, although some people would say they were settled rather than invaded, but they had a treaty and everything. But the consequences of the Māori positioning in New Zealand carries over into Australia, so it's different from a lot of the other new migrants. And these groups are in a really interesting position of trying to situate themselves on First Nations land and be really respectful of the fact that they are on First Nations land now, but trying to maintain their Indigenous culture as well and their own connections to land. So some of the work I'm doing, which I can talk more about, I'm doing some of the work with these communities around cultural connection back to New Zealand and Aotearoa, and how do we do that in Australia in a way that's respectful but also meaningful for the students. So yes, there are a lot of complexities here, but there's nevertheless another group and I could do the same for care leavers and to some extent parents and carers as well. There are a few individualised groups, but this one's notable, I think. And regional differences as well. So I mentioned Logan. Logan is essentially a suburb of Brisbane. It's called a separate city, but it's about 20, 25 kilometres from the CBD. It's really an urban satellite. And you see the attainment there is very high in Brisbane, which is the capital of Queensland, like 50%, but very low in Logan, which is, as I say, it's essentially part of Brisbane. And those other two Toowoomba towns for the regional areas, they're lower as well. But the reason I use this slide in Australia is to show that we talk about regional, rural and remote as being a challenge for attainment and access, but there are massive differences in urban areas as well. So, as I said, Logan is essentially now a suburb, and it's got lower attainment than places like Toowoomba towns, which are much further away from the capital city, much more regional. So geographic inequities exist not only between the country and the city, but within cities as well. Now, here's another chart, completely different. This is really to say, I've been talking about access, but there are challenges across the life cycle for equity. And this gives you a good understanding of some of the challenges for graduate outcomes. So some groups have very poor access. Some groups access higher education, but then struggle with success and retention. And some groups struggle with the graduate outcomes. And here you can see, so again, don't worry too much about all of the noise here, but if you look at the bachelor degree data, so that third column from the left, a Somali with a bachelor degree, a Somali Australian with a bachelor degree, has a fairly similar unemployment rate to a non-Somali who leaves secondary education at year 9 and below, so on that far column. So the grey is all of Australia and the blue is Somali. So essentially what that shows you is that it is still worth Somali Australians studying. They still get a benefit, so a reduced unemployment rate for each level of education. But we're still getting massive differences in graduate outcomes. So bachelor degree outcomes are very poor for Somali Australians. And of course, that's partly the result of networks, but also conscious and unconscious bias. And one of the things that's interesting to me is that in the past, universities would say, this is not really our problem. We graduate good students, and if they don't get jobs, that's not really our problem. That's a workforce issue, or it's an issue of bias outside of the university. We're no longer saying that as much, partly because we have forms of performance-based funding and an assumption that universities are responsible for graduate outcomes as well as just graduating good students, so that the point of accountability, if you like, doesn't end at graduation. It is further down the road. And of course, those graduate outcomes are coming back into student platforms as well, so students can see what their likelihood outcomes are before they enroll. So we're getting an extension of university accountability, if you like, beyond completion. But that chart shows you that we have equity issues across the life cycle. One of the issues in Australia, I think, has been that equity has been very focused on access. So the original 6 equity groups were established because they were underrepresented at university. And a lot of our focus has been on trying to get more students in. But we probably need more focus on success and retention and also outcomes, I think, and understanding that different groups have different challenges at different points. So, for instance, by contrast, Indigenous Australians with a bachelor degree do very well overall because they're in high demand and graduate outcomes are actually pretty good, but very poor retention, which again is a result of campus climate and a range of other issues. So there is a life cycle challenge we have to understand when we talk about equity. And just finally to note a couple of other things in the accord. So while they're setting up a separate outreach program, which is not very large actually, but they are talking about trying to make that more targeted, more place-based, more community focused, and particularly more collaborative. So I think the government now is very keen on consortia approaches, and I'm not sure exactly how that's going to play out, but I think it's unlikely we're going to see individual universities marching off to individual schools with showbags and talking to students in that way. I think they're much more interested in collaborative approaches. I know you've had similar conversations over the last decade or two in the UK around these models of outreach as well. And the final point is just around mission-based compacts, which again are similar to the access and participation plans here, but not confined to equity. They are going to be around mission, but I think we're likely to see targets fixed under those compacts so that universities have to create their own agreement with government around how they're going to support their own community. We've had a lot of conversations about social license recently in Australia and whether universities have a social license to operate and how they work with communities ethically. And I think compacts will refocus us on place and on how universities do serve their communities. Of course, some universities are largely online, so that's another challenge. But we're likely to see a move towards more nuanced approaches to equity, I think, provided the bureaucracy can handle this and understanding that the departments are not well staffed and the policy landscape is not populated by a heavy or equivalent institutes typically, so we are limited resource wise. So that's the state of play in terms of the accord. I hope there are some questions, and I'm sorry I kind of rushed through it, but I wanted to leave some time for questions, and I'm looking forward to what folks might have to say, and happy to leave it there. So thanks.
Thank you very much, Andrew. Great. Hopefully you'll have your camera on so that people online can see you. That's brilliant. So we have a nice backdrop of the harbour there. That's lovely. I will as well, just so that we can.
That's not Australia, but
so I'm just going to put the sound up for those people who want to join online and ask a question. Please do raise your hand or just post a quick in the chat. But we can start in the room if anyone in the room would like to fire us off. And Rachel, please.
Yeah, I mean, I guess when we look at Australia compared to lots of other countries around the world, you have been kind of conscious of equity issues, widening participation issues for quite a long time compared to some other nations. Are there any initiatives that you think have actually worked well, whether that be an individual university or an individual state? Are there any elements of good practice in what you've been doing so far that we've learned from?
Yeah. So Dorothy discussed the starting. I think I would say the enabling program worked very well. The enabling programs. So in the new system, they're called fee-free, university-ready programs, but they're enabling programs.
They were for the mature students.
Yeah, so these were started in the 70s, I think, around retrenched steel workers in Newcastle. Mm-hmm. And it was a way of retraining folks who had lost their jobs. And the University of Newcastle now, around 20, so Newcastle is Newcastle's just north of Sydney. It's a port town, a big steel industry, now there's a big coal industry, so big mining heritage. And around 20% of the first year cohort of Newcastle comes through their enabling programs. And there's 3 streams, I think, one of which is an Indigenous only stream. But one of the things I argued was that income contingent loans, and I heard this again last week at Widening actually, that so the income contingent loans that UK and Australia both have, they haven't deterred. So when those when fees have risen, it hasn't affected equity. There's sometimes a small blip when the fees rise, but then it goes back to normal. So it hasn't really deterred folks. That seems to be the logic or the common argument. But it does deter people. And we look at the enabling program to prove that, is when we say that there are twice the number of OSCS students who enroll through an enabling program than into undergraduate. And I think it's 5 times for Indigenous students. We get much refugee background care leaves. We get much more representation of minoritized students in through the enabling program because it's tuition free. And I think part of it is the money itself and part of it is the formality. There are some people who are, I mean, there are cases where, so it's a terrible example, but it's quite common where wives, for instance, would not be allowed really to enroll at university, but they will be allowed to do an enabling program, just to turn up to the university and do a tuition-free course. So I think those programs have been really effective in the mature age space. What we need is to adapt them in the secondary school space more and to get more synthesis between secondary and higher education. I think the HEP program worked pretty well. Although, I mean, evidence has been patchy in terms of the outreach with school. Because again, I think we're going to schools, but we're not going there doing curricular work. We have a kind of split between professional staff and academic staff. So that's a big problem. But, you know, broadly that has definitely focused minds, and we've got a lot more money in equity than we ever had before. So that's $168 million annually. It goes into HEP at the moment. That's not insignificant. So for our university, it ends up being about $5 million a year, which, you know, is a lot more money than we used to have to think about equity programs. And I think the demand-driven system made a difference as well. So we had a period in about 2010 where we uncapped places. Essentially, universities were allowed to enroll as many students as they could, provided they thought they were able to complete. That did lead to a greater expansion than the government thought. So it's now sort of recapped. But it did lead to high numbers of underrepresented students. The question mark over that was the preparedness of those students. So we can get more equity students. I hate the word equity students. We can get more underrepresented students in if we lower the bar, but that's not the answer. I think the answer is to build academic preparedness and to build those school communities. So there's a couple of things I think that work.
Lots of ideas. Colin, you put your hand up. Do you want to ask a question?
Yeah, thanks, David. Hi, Andrew. Yeah, I just wonder if you could tell us a bit more about the plans for compacts and the plans for collaborative outreach, because they're both things that we've had quite a long while in the UK. We've had access agreements and then became access and participation plans going back to 2006, and we've had collaborative programs like Aim Higher, NNCO, NCOP, UniConnect. We've had 20 years of those. And now the latest thing is to try and merge, is trying to get, whereas the access and participation plans were by individual institutions competing for students, whereas the collaborative outreach was meant to group all the institutions in an area so that they did their outreach collectively. Now there's a move to sort of have groups of universities sharing an access participation plan. So I wonder, I know they've both been mooted for a while in Australia. What do we know about what sort of model those two things are going to take?
Not much.
Is that question too big? Too big.
So, if I maybe to start on the compacts issue, we don't know much about it. We don't know how many, how big the sort of carrots and sticks will be. There's been a push to differentiate universities for a long time, but not really any financial means of doing so. So the government says, how come we've got 38 universities all teaching accounting degrees? And think, well, follow the money. You need to, if you want differentiation, you've got to set up a structure for that. So the mission-based compacts could do that if they have sufficient funding attached to them. I guess what I'm interested in is the potential of those compacts to provide differentiation in terms of equity. So for instance, for Griffith University, around 10% of our population in Logan are Māori and Pasifika. That's unusual. That's the highest in Australia. And so we should have a focus on those groups. We do. We have an outreach program and a student support program. But what would that look like under a mission-based compact? How can we speak to particular groups in our area that we can't really do now? Because the equity framework now is just those 6 broad groups. It's quite limited. So I've been talking about care leaver students for more than a decade. We're not making any progress. We've been talking about refugee background students for a long time. We're not making a lot of progress there. military veterans are not making much progress there. So the mission-based compacts might give us a way of nuancing some of that work, particularly for universities where there might be prisons in the region. There's a lot of work in prisons going on now. There might be high proportions of certain groups of students. So it will give some flexibility around that in the equity space. But I mean, the truth is, I don't know. I don't think anyone really knows what the mission-based compact is. It's all we know is we tried it before and it didn't work very well. There's a lot of paperwork because it wasn't tied to enough targets. So I think that will grow. And the collaborative outreach, similarly, I think, yeah, you're right. I mean, at High, we have a lot of that here. There was an evaluation of HEP a few years ago that basically said we can't tell much about the effectiveness of the school outreach work. Seems like everyone's busy, but it doesn't seem very clear cause and effect of whether those students are coming to university more. I guess what I'm hoping, it's a bit of a different question maybe, but the split I mentioned between academic and professional, I think, is a really important part of this equity conversation. Most of the staff employed under HEP are professional staff. Do you have the same term? Administrative staff, professional staff, non-academic.
Professional services staff, we call them here. Yeah, and they tend to be a very large group within each institution.
Yeah, I mean, it's around about 50-50. So all of the equity work, well, most of the equity work is driven by the professional side of the organisation. So what I would like to see, for instance, in the schools is, instead of us going into the schools and trying to raise aspirations, that we're trying to raise achievement, and we're using curricular and pedagogical reform to do that. And that may or may not be part of the collaborative. I mean, hopefully there's a research-informed element to the collaboration. But I think we have to do things differently from what we've been doing in the schools. If we just go in there and try to demystify university by generic kind of aspiration raising activities or that kind of program, it's not likely to be effective. My argument is always that we need to demystify university by doing university. The easiest way to demystify is to have some kind of curriculum that university has approved. Might not be a first year subject. Shouldn't be a first year subject in most cases. It should be some form of the enabling program adapted into the schools. So I'm not sure what the policies will look like in the end. The outreach department at the moment is quite small. It's about 44 million. I mentioned we have 168 million across HEP at the moment. So I don't think it's actually going to go very far unless they change their settings. I think it's a bit of a problem, to be honest, in the current architecture. But all this is to be worked through. So, we need more contribution from policy experts like yourself, Colin, to help us get the right answer.
I'll come over and advise you any day.
Okay.
Colin, that's great. And yeah, Colin, the webinar on I think your experience is really valuable. And I guess so we have a question from Marion online, but I'll also ask you a question myself. You highlighting the importance of working in schools. You highlighted the idea of dual enrollments as a way of enabling opportunities, so enabling programs. Is there a debate about abolishing ATAR? It seems to me that is a huge debate. I mean, you're forcing people into a bifurcated education system really early on, and even before 16 now, actually.
Yes, so there is a big debate, and a lot of people want to abolish the ATAR. But it's almost the wrong debate in some ways, in my view, because the people defending ATAR will say it's the best predictor of performance at university. And when we go around ATAR, and what are we going to do? We're going to use interviews, well, that's even more biased. We're going to use portfolios, that's even more biased. So we're struggling, I think, to find alternatives to ATAR. I actually think school marks just without the ATAR would be fine. But one of the challenges with ATAR is that people who defend it say it's a very good predictor, and it is a very good predictor because it's essentially defining the last 2 or 3 years of curriculum in the schools. So if you've done the ATAR track subjects and you get a reasonable ATAR, yes, you're going to do well, compared to if you were streamed into a non-university track, non-ATAR track, you did a range of subjects that were not particularly university preparation subjects, and then you just transferred on an ATAR equivalence or some other contextual admissions, then of course you're going to be worse because the system is designed so that ATAR will be predictive. It's not the kind of magic. It's actually the whole structure is framed that way. So I think, I personally do think ATAR needs to go. But we need to be a lot more thoughtful around what would replace it. And I mean, it's hugely problematic to me, and we keep coming up against that response of, yes, but it's a good predictive indicator. Like, yeah, well, it is, but it's not just a number that's created at the end of the process. It drives the curriculum for the previous 2 or 3 years. So that's why it is such a powerful predictor. So I think we just need to keep making that case that what we're talking about is not whether we do a fancy number at the end or whether we use interviews or something else. It's actually what we're doing from year 9, year 10 through. Yeah, it's a huge problem.
The problem of valuing we measure rather than measuring value. So we have Nareen and Sue online. Nareen, you asked quite a long question. Do you want to try and summarize it? And then Sue.
Oh, hi, thank you. Andrew, I'd like to sort of go back to this idea of compacts and what you said earlier about the proportion of people going from on the non-ATAR route and probably going through the vocational education and training route. And I want to sort of pick up on the work that you know I was involved in, and you have as well, on looking at people going through the TAFEs and moving through to higher levels of higher education outside of the university structures. And I just wondered, in this discussion about mission-based compacts, whether there's any further discussion about trying to work more closely with that kind of higher level work going on in the non-university sector.
Yeah. I see so many familiar faces. It's great. But yes,
And I'm in England, by the way, not in Australia now.
Okay, good. Yes, I mean, there is a conversation around this. One of the 3 main commissioners who's been appointed to the interim body of ATEC is Barney Glover, who at the same time is running Jobs and Skills Australia, which is essentially a body focused on tertiary education and outcomes. So there's definitely a push around harmonisation as the language at the moment between the 2 sectors. And we know for a lot of groups, including care leaders, that they're more likely to come in through TAFE or VET than schools. And just for everybody's erudition, TAFE is essentially the public provision of VET. So it's just tertiary and further education institutes, right? But it's essentially vocational education can be provided publicly through government TAFE, or it can be done privately through a non-government VET body. So there will be conversations more, I think, around how the 2 sectors work together. And interestingly, even the ATEC is a tertiary education commission, so it's very explicitly not a higher education commission. So even just in that framing, I imagine when the commission starts, there's going to be a lot of conversation around how do we connect these 2 things. And I would say, you know, as many folks probably know, the vocational sector, because there's a higher level of private provision and a much bigger panoply of offerings and providers, it tends to be patchy. And a lot of the VET that's offered in schools that students study is done through private RTOs, most registered training organisations, private VET providers, most of it's not done through TAFE, sometimes by the schools themselves. Some schools, secondary schools, can be providers of VET for their students. So it's the quality is quite variable as well, particularly at those lower levels. So there's a lot of challenges in vocational education, including low completion rates and funding. And the VET sector has been really starved of funding in recent years. So we talk about parity of esteem and trying to have vocational education on the same level as higher education. A lot of people get quite outraged at the way the higher education gets preference that they perceive in schools. But I'm always intrigued by that a little bit, because over half, so for instance in Queensland, over 50% of students are doing some VET in schools and only 2% of some higher ed school. So certainly in the ATAR track, yes, there's a preference towards higher education, but if you look at the overall school sector, I'm not sure you'd say that person Queensland. But yeah, so a lot of debates and very few people across both sectors, and I think it's something that if we're going to get that growth in equity across tertiary education, we need to do the work across both of them. So I'm not sure that really answered your question, but yes, it's very important. I think it will be definitely a conversation, just the way that ASIC is set up and who's on there as well.
Would you be encouraging schools to do this both?
Yeah, well, I think this is one of the problems, is that you get streamed into either universities for people like you or it's not for people like you, and you're making decisions. And we talk about mobility and choice a lot, but you just see from the data, there's not a lot of mobility, at least initially. Those choices seem pretty fixed. What we would prefer is that students are mixing and matching more, I mean, what worries me is that there's a stereotype for minoritized communities particularly, that university is not for them, and that probably holds, or it's probably very hard for them to get back from that. So it's not even a question of academic achievement. You can always study more, but if you believe something when you're 14 or 15, it's very hard to demystify that.
Great, thank you very much for the good question. Thank you, and Andrew. Nari, you asked a couple of questions in the chat. Do you want to sort of?
Yes, I'm sorry. I asked 2 questions, but I will summarize it like 1 question. Thank you so much for these insightful presentations. So actually, when it comes to post-secondary transition, it feels like the students are on their own. That's what I found in South Asia countries, and also how universities in Australia are seeing themselves as a key actors and active actors in this transition, or is it viewed as the responsibility of schools or governments, or if it is like a shared responsibility, how how the accountability is distributed? Thank you so much.
Great, thanks, Nari.
Yeah, thank you. Well, I'd say the sectors are still very distinct, and we're in an era of universal higher education according to the Mountain Trail typology. We've got over half of people going to university, and yet we get complete sector shock, even from very advantaged students who transition to university. So universities and schools are still 2 different compared to where they should be. It would be, I mean, if you went from primary to secondary school, you wouldn't get the kind of shock you get from secondary to university. And we're in a very different, we're still operating in a lot of ways as if university was just for the elite 5% of students back in the 70s. And so I think there's a lot of transition work that needs to happen. I think for the schools in Australia, the transition work is almost, I wouldn't say it's almost zero, but there's no accountability really for school outcome. If you say, well, so schools advertise their average ATAR, they'll promote that. The average ATAR that their students receive will be on billboards and things. But if you ask them about their post-secondary outcomes, they don't receive the data, they don't know, they're not accountable for it. So there are schools in Queensland, for instance, where there are no students doing the ATAR track at all in year 12. The entire cohort is doing non-university pathways or non-ATAR pathways. And that's not advertised, though. We just know that because we happen to know the principles. So there's huge gaps in terms of extending the accountability of secondary schools into post-secondary outcomes, not just universities, but what happens afterwards. I think there should be more attention on that. And I think from the university's point of view, there's a lot of work around transition pedagogy, and particularly in the Nathan programs and elsewhere. So I think universities are getting better at teaching to different groups of first-year students. But, you know, as I said, the outreach in the schools themselves is still pretty limited and not necessarily informed by that practice. I think that the teaching itself of first-year students has improved, and to a much more diverse cohort, obviously, than we ever used to have. But there's still a lot of gaps around that transition period itself, as you say, including financial and support. So yeah, it remains a massive issue.
So the answer is everyone's responsibility, and people aren't necessarily taking it.
Yeah, and I guess it falls into that gap, right? So secondary schools say, well, we're done. End of year 12, you've got this secondary certificate, so that's the end of our accountability. And universities are waiting until students start to say, well, we can't start until you enroll. So you've got that kind of gap.
No, I think that's a great question, Aaron. Thank you very much. Are there any more questions online or in the room? We have probably time for just one more. Crystal in the room.
Thank you, David. Thank you, Andrew, for your great presentation, very insightful. And And I have a question about what do students think about higher education in this context? Like those students from marginalized groups, for example, the Indigenous group, do they see themselves less competitive for higher education in terms of access, or do they generally think they don't, maybe, I don't know, I'm lacking context, don't belong to the knowledge system? Because I learned a little bit about like decolonized curriculum in many countries, including your context. And I'm wondering, is this also the concern of students? And in addition to considering access, do you also consider curriculum or knowledge system as a parallel issue?
Yes, a nice easy one to finish on. Thanks. Yes. There's been a big move in recent years to decolonize the curriculum and decolonize the university more broadly. And what does that mean? Well, various things, but if you look at, for instance, just the examples that are provided in the curriculum and that all of this that we've known for many years, it speaks to some students but doesn't speak to others. So there is a real push towards indigenising the curriculum and introducing Indigenous perspectives into the curriculum in universities. A lot of that work is happening, but it's clearly not enough because we're clearly getting very high attrition rates of First Nations students in particular. And part of that clearly is that they don't feel that they belong on the campus. So there is work around decolonising the curriculum. Most universities would have something around that. For migrant groups, it's variable. I mean, if I go back again to Māori and Pasifika students, we've got 4 Pasifika academics in Griffith, I think, and I've hired 2 of them. So it's not a high representation, not a lot of role modelling. But again, we're trying to introduce those methodologies and curriculum more widely into the experience. I think, it's an ongoing challenge. So there's work happening, but clearly a lot of students who get to university still don't feel like they belong and or matter. And obviously we've seen a lot of this in the last couple of years as well, just globally. So there is a big push towards Indigenised curriculum in particular and bringing Indigenous perspectives in, but still a long way to go. And you can see in the attrition rates that there are still some students who don't feel comfortable on campus. Yeah.
There's a lot more than curriculum. It's about creating campus cultures that actually make people feel they belong.
Yeah, very, very much so. And everything from the very individualistic way that higher education is framed compared to the much more community framed models of some groups. There's a lot more work to be done around reframing those kind of competitive, individualistic, very kind of white histories of universities into more collaborative and community-driven institutions.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Priscilla. Great last question. Andrew, and thank you again. You've given us, you've shown us how important it is to really get into the implementation to detail. It's so much of this plays out within the stuff that's not necessarily in the statistics. It's actually understanding the context that drive the statistics, and you've got so much experience here that I think really helps us understand what seems to be an impressive compact actually has a lot of challenges for it actually to be meaningful. So thank you very much again. So just at past 3 o'clock, we're here in the UK. We'll finish now. Do join us next week. We have a co-research into higher education theory and practice webinar next week with my colleague from Poland, Christian Sadowski, and several students who will be talking about writing a jointly written book about student occupation of dormitories in Poland in response to the attempts to increase fees. So that's next week's webinar, last couple before we have a summer break. Do join us again. Thanks very much, everyone. See you soon. Bye.